that mental health has like really come out into the open. Like it's risen up the agenda of payers and employers because it's unignorable. People are talking about it a lot more. And what's more, people are unable to access the traditional forms of care. So it's accelerated digital interventions as an obvious way to provide care given the constraints of COVID.
And now, from San Francisco and the UCSF Rosenman Institute, the Health Technology Podcast with your host, Christine Winoto.
This is an episode you don't want to sleep on because today we're hosting Peter Hames, the co-founder and CEO of Big Health. Peter is also an NHS Innovation Fellow and holds a master's in experimental psychology from Oxford. As a former insomniac, Peter was frustrated by the limited treatments available for sleep difficulties. And so, inspired by his own success with cognitive behavioral therapy, he founded Big Health in order to deliver CBT-based insomnia treatment and mental health care to patients all around the world. Today, Big Health delivers fully virtual therapeutic for those struggling with their mental health. It is a 24-hour solution with the digital therapeutic Sleepio, addressing sleep difficulties, and Daylight, addressing daytime worry and anxiety. In this episode, we discuss pandemic-era mental health, the far-reaching effects of insomnia, and how Big Health can offer a solution. Here's our conversation. Well, welcome, Peter. Thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Yeah, excited to be here.
I'm so excited. We had your talk a couple of weeks ago, but I think having you in the podcast will be really interesting for a lot of our listeners to hear about your background. Shall we start?
Sounds great. Yeah.
So I thought it would be good for a lot of our listeners to hear about your background and how that background has helped you prepare with this journey of you starting and running Big Health.
No, absolutely. And of course, Big Health, digital therapeutics company focused on sleep and mental health, really did start from a very personal place. I developed insomnia back when I was back in the UK several years ago. And for anyone that's experienced insomnia, true sort of chronic clinical level insomnia will know that it's a pretty bad experience. And the best way I would describe it is to ask the sort of rhetorical question, like, name an area of your life that sleep doesn't affect. And the truth is there isn't one. Like, from your mood to your productivity to, like, as a result, your relationships, everything is affected by it, and it can feel like, you're completely trapped in it. And if it's very isolating, especially when you're awake through the night, like you feel like the only person who's awake on earth, and so I'm very fortunate that I had studied experimental psychology at undergrad. So I'm not a clinician, I'm not a trained psychologist, but I do know the science behind non-drug therapies for these problems, including insomnia, anxiety, depression, predominant of which is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT for short, traditionally delivered by a human therapist. And I went to my doctor in the UK, my PCP, my GP, very sort of announced my self-diagnosis in a very self-satisfied way, and asked for a course of CBT. And the doctor promptly told me where to stick it and prescribed me Ambien, prescribed me sleeping pills. And so whatever I did, that's all I could get was medications. And, I knew from my degree, like, these are not recommended or even effective for chronic insomnia. And yet that was all I could get access to, And so eventually, out of desperation, I ended up self-administering a program of CBT from a self-help book written by this world expert, this guy called Professor Colin Espy. And like any self-help book, chapter a week, very manual process, very clunky. You have to photocopy out sleep diaries, like do math, that's a very arduous process. But in just 6 weeks, I was totally cured, like totally better.
And what do you think? Does it eradicate the root cause of or is just how to manage your sleep better?
Yes, the way I would talk about it, and this is the way that the CBT, what the approach that CBT takes is to say, is that it rebuilds a healthy relationship with your sleep. And so it's not to say that you never have a bad night's sleep. Like that would be unusual if you didn't have the odd bad nights, when you're stressed or something's on your mind or something's happened in your life that disrupts it. What it means is those odd nights don't cascade and snowball into this huge self-feeding problem of insomnia. And it unlocks the vicious cycle that perpetuates the problem. And anyone who's had insomnia will know, like it's you start to like dread going to bed. Like the very idea of going to sleep stresses you out. Because you're sort of steeling yourself for another bad night, and that in itself makes it a lot less likely that you're going to get to sleep. And so in the morning, you're like, told you so, told you I wasn't going to go to sleep, I knew I was right. And it just reconfirms this thought process. And so before long, you get so used to being stressed in your bedroom that your bedroom makes you stressed. And so essentially, the CBT works to kind of unpick and help you dissolve that vicious cycle and get back to a sort of normal sleep relationship.
Okay, so basically you cure yourself with this new treatment, CBT, based on your self-help book. And so what have you done so far besides, you graduate from your psychology, you just kind of wandering around and not sleep?
Yes, this was obviously many years after I'd completed my degree, but it was still in the back of my mind, the knowledge about CBT and that experience of achieving this magical experience of using these techniques to overcome this problem that I had seemed to me completely insurmountable. Like I have a degree in this stuff, and I didn't know how to solve it. So applying CBT, which is effectively evidence-based common sense, right? Like it's very practical, very easy to understand, very easy to implement. Felt like magic, right? And it kind of blew my mind. The second reaction to it was, this is totally insane. Like we have hundreds of millions of people across the world, who are suffering from problems like I was, like insomnia, anxiety, depression, for which we have these proven behavioral non-drug solutions like CBT. And yet no one can get it. All that anyone can get is drugs. Mm-hmm. And so that's really what sparked this thought, this idea of the only way that I can see to bridge that gap in need is to figure out a way to take these very effective techniques and fully automate them, right? So allow them to be as scalable and consistent as drugs by delivering it in a way that is pure software. So no humans involved, no books involved, something that can scale to the level of need that we see out there in the population. And so I then, having had that epiphany, rang up the guy that wrote the book that cured me, this guy called Professor Colin Espy, put on a suit, got on a plane. He lives up in Glasgow. And, we became co-founders, told him about the idea. And, Colin and I have really built the company together. He's, very world-renowned clinical expert, 30, 40 years of clinical research experience, hundreds of clinical trial papers published. And it's been a really amazing partnership and blending of our respective skills and experiences to get to Big Health where it is today.
But what were you doing before, in between you graduate from the psychology and then you have this epiphany? You must have done something.
I
you just get out from college, you cannot sleep, and then I want to start a company.
No, there was a winding road. I'd say I have the resume of a lunatic. It doesn't make a huge amount of sense, apart from maybe in retrospect. And so I had done everything from working in communication strategy, within advertising, through to working in a karaoke business. So
interesting. What is that karaoke business?
So you can draw your own sort of connections between karaoke and insomnia. I'll let you draw those. But in the more serious way of describing that is I worked for a lady called Martha Lane Fox in the UK. So she is very famous in the UK as one of the leading tech entrepreneurs. Founded lastminute.com in the UK and is now Baroness, and sort of the tech czar in the UK. And worked with her on building one of her companies, and that's where I got a lot of the knowledge and skills around how to think about building technology, building engineering teams, and so on and so forth. And it was actually while working for her that I did develop insomnia, and obviously the rest is history.
Okay, so that makes sense. So it's not like you just woke up one day after you could not sleep and cure yourself. It's like, okay. So that's interesting. So when you go reach, maybe it would be good to for us to hear about your journey about the Big Health. When you have that vision, you went to convince the clinical psychologist, Colin Espy, to join you. What were you asking him? Like, what is the vision you're selling him?
Totally. I remember very vividly, the day that I first called him, and I just cold called him, right? So it was on my lunch break. I was in London, walking around a freezing, square in London because I had to take the calls sort of out the office. And, very tentatively, it was cold, rang the number. He picked up. I was like, "Oh, Professor Espy, it's you don't know me, but my name's Peter Hames. I used your book. It cured me. Just got this idea, I think we can get this to more people." And he was like, "Do you know how many of these calls I get a week?" Really dismiss it. And I had to therefore he's a very no nonsense Scottish, amazingly obviously warm and brilliant human, but it's certainly no nonsense and direct. And so I actually originally the idea was a bit broader. It was just a general insight that this is insomnia sufferers as a group of people are really underserved, and really there's a huge need there for us to provide them with provide people with better solutions. We immediately had a meeting of minds as soon as I landed in. I'm a big fan of it's different now in COVID, but the value.
But what did you tell him when you said I got a lot of this kind of phone call in a week? You must have convinced him for him to let you fly in to meet with him.
It was all about. It's akin to the overarching principle of a sales process. I was all I wanted was to get that meeting with him. So I can't remember exactly what I said, but I was let me just come up and see you, and we can talk about it. And this was saying that I think it's different now post COVID, but in general, I would say that get on the plane. The value of what that shows in terms of how serious you are, and and obviously makes it easy for the other person, but to be able to show that this is all right, I'm going to take the effort to fly over and to see you and talk about it, I think carries a lot of weight. And he picked me up from the airport, and even in the drive from there to his lab or his house, very quickly we realized that it was a meeting of minds, and we shared a lot of values and motivations, both from both sides. It's very personal motivation. I think he saw the sincerity of that, and it kind of went from there.
Yeah. So that's exciting. That's great that that first phone call, and then it worked out. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about what is your North Star for the Big Health, and then what is it that the technology that you're doing to solve that particular problem?
Yeah, so our purpose at Big Health is to help millions back to good mental health. No asterisk, no small print. That is the North Star of the business, and every decision we make as an organization has to get us closer to that goal in a straight line. And I say it like a scratch record at the start of every team meeting. Our purpose is to help millions back to good mental health. I'd be amazed if anyone in the company can't recite that word for word. And I found that to be a very, very really effective way to keep keep myself and everyone else focused. I think the biggest risk, especially in an area as complex as healthcare, is actually that you sort of lose sight and get distracted, that you end up getting pulled in a certain direction given, barriers and constraints. And so therefore constantly being able to snap back up and go, hang on, what are we optimizing for here? We're optimizing for helping many, 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 many people as rapidly as possible is a really helpful way to reprioritize, whenever you get stuck.
And so the technology that you developed, you mentioned earlier about basically converting a lot of the manual, whatever that's on that book, and then convert it into a user-friendly software interface. I don't want to explain it because I think you would do a better job in explaining it than me.
Yeah. So the approach is to, what we're focused on is building these like pure software, fully automated, but clinically rigorous digital therapeutic programs for mental health. And that involves, looking at the science behind what is effective for human delivered therapy, but not just like copy and paste, like translate it into a digital context, but think very, very sort of creatively about like, how do we take the active ingredients here and like transform it and translate it into a format that's going to be very effective, delivered, via your phone in a pure digital form. And so, we have two products, Sleepio and Daylight. Sleepio is focused on insomnia, Daylight on worry and anxiety. Both very powerfully evidence-based. So we've conducted, 13 randomized control trials now on our actual products. And those data show that our effectiveness is very high. So over 70% remission rates for both products, even though there's no humans involved whatsoever. And, a big piece of beyond that is actually how we get it in people's hands. And so working with the pharmacy benefit managers, the PBMs, to deliver our solutions as non-drug alternatives for mental health, via a lot of the same channels that are used for other therapeutics.
This podcast is sponsored by Brown Rudnick's Global Life Sciences Group, a team of legal professionals that help life science companies, lenders, and investors around the world turn good science into good business. Learn more at brownrudnick.com. This podcast is also sponsored by Canon Quality Group. Canon Quality Group has been helping medtech startups set up quality management systems for over 10 years. If you're unsure when to get started with quality management in your startup, turn to the experts at canonqualitygroup.com.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned that you have work with CVS to try to deploy more of your technology to more people. Can you share with us your journey in getting your first big account?
Yeah, totally. So as you say, like today we work through CVS Health is one of our key partners. And, they're obviously a huge pharmacy benefit manager, 100 million covered lives. And, it's a really productive way for us to reduce the barriers associated with employers and other health plans being able to like offer our products to their populations. But as you say, like where it all began was much more basic. So, I should say, actually, the spirit of the story, like, we had, there's a whole series of different chapters to Big Health as a company. Initially after that conversation with Colin in the UK, we bootstrapped for a long time. It was just basically us running off vapors, working with money we'd saved personally to develop the first version of the product with a very, very lean team, and to get the first clinical evidence. And that was all done literally without having raised any money whatsoever. We tried taking it out to market, like via retail in the UK. That was one of our first attempts to go, how do we actually commercialize this and get it into the hands of people who need it? So Boots the Chemist, a big pharmacy chain in the UK, we had a partnership with them. We created literally physical box products that we put on shelf next to the sleeping pills in like 100 stores, and it didn't work. And so, we learned a lot from that, and spent, a good few years in the UK trying and failing to find a way to make this very effective product commercially successful. And
what did you learn that why it did not work? Is it because you put it next to the sleeping pill, and sleeping pill seems to be like you just pop it in and then you sleep?
it's well, I would, this is obviously so many years ago now, and so I do think that it was a very different, context in terms of the behaviors that people were used to following. In terms of now, it's obviously a lot more natural for people to seek health, their health care through the internet, and through technology-enabled methods. So I think back then it was partly that there was it was the idea. It was ahead of its time to some extent. Like it's now is really the moment where we're seeing this really coming into its own. All it took was a global pandemic, and so I think the reasons it didn't work were numerous. It taught me a lot about the importance of it being a reimbursed product. So with it being consumer paid, it created some misaligned incentives actually, whereby the great beauty of our approach is that we can deliver really good sustained health very, very quickly. Like it can be something where we're given it CBT a short number of weeks, and you can be very long term healthy again. And so the traditional consumer models about doing a subscription model where you're essentially trying to keep someone engaged in the treatment for months or years is very inconsistent with what I saw as the benefit of the intervention, which is we want to be aligned in getting you healthy as quickly as possible. And so I realized, through that experience, that our customer is not actually the end patient or user. It's whoever economically benefits from that person being healthy as quickly as possible. And that entity is actually whoever pays for their healthcare costs. So in the UK, it's the NHS. In the US, as we know, it's employers, it's health plans. And that's really what informed when we came to the US 5-6 years ago. It really gave us the conviction to go, we should be striving for this to be a reimbursed product, like akin to other therapeutics, and start on that path.
It's kind of interesting you're saying that you would think the patients want to get better as soon as possible. Yet you mentioned the payers has a lot more interest to get the patient to feel better sooner. How is that? It seems kind of odd.
Oh, yeah. What I mean is that, I feel we've seen some great success stories in the consumer, at least consumer wellness space, of where subscription models have been very effective. Where a small amount of money over a very long period of time, right? Where it could be like a Headspace or a Calm, like these more consumer focused apps have been very successful in that way. The challenge is that if you imagine, what is my if I'm that solution, what are my incentives? Like my incentives are for you to stick around as long as possible, because I want to collect as much subscription revenue from you as possible. And if this is a sort of ongoing support, that might be fine. But the beauty of CBT is that we deliver outcomes very quickly. Like, in a very short number of weeks, we can get you healthy for years. And so, like, the problem is that though you can see how those two incentives fight against each other, like, I don't want to be driven economically to try to addict people to a service. Like, that's obviously what's wrong with healthcare is there's too many incentives, economic incentives to deliver maximum treatment rather than the minimum treatment necessary to get someone healthy.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's really interesting. One of the things that I thought was really interesting, like you mentioned it earlier about evidence-based, that you built that clinical evidence since the very beginning. And can you tell us more about that and why it's so important to a lot of the things that you do at the Big Health?
In terms of clinical evidence?
Yeah.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, like Colin takes all the credit for this, my co-founder, Professor SB, it was really initially, his drive, and his like experience and perspective, which led us to investing in clinical evidence. So it comes from initially more of a bottom-up values perspective rather than anything else. Like, it's just the right thing to do, right? So if we're going to deliver care that is, is a true therapeutic, we need to be making sure that we're collecting the data to show that it's effective and safe as any other type of therapeutic. And so, we did our first placebo group randomized control trial, way back before we raised money. Like that was like one of the first things that we did, which to this day is like leads the field in terms of how rigorous the clinical evaluation is. And since then, that clinical evidence base has grown exponentially. So we now have over 60 publications, like I say, 13 randomized controlled trials. A fact that still blows my mind, more participants have taken part in controlled studies of Sleepio than have ever taken part in studies of Ambien, by a very long way. And, the value of that is that, beyond the sort of ethical reasons for doing it, in that we should only be doing things that work and are safe, is that in terms of that reimbursement coverage, it's incredibly powerful, right? So like chief medical officers, like other decision makers and payers, can see with their own eyes, like, yes, this thing is effective and yes, it saves money.
And so you mentioned earlier about, you kind of get the clinical evidence even when you don't have the money. Oftentimes, a lot of the entrepreneurs are saying, well, we need the money in order for us to build that clinical evidence. How do you do that without the money?
Yeah, and I've heard that a lot as well. And there's no shortage of ways to spend a lot of money collecting clinical evidence. That's certainly true. What I would say is that we are living proof that it's possible to collect a lot of evidence without spending a lot of money. There's very high quality clinical evidence published in the leading journals like JAMA, Lancet Psychiatry, and so forth. And the key to that is to make sure that clinical and research is really central to what you do from the start. So I had the great benefit of Colin as a co-founder, where given his global reputation, given his ability to structure and like conduct research himself, like obviously in collaboration with other independent researchers, it was how we got the ball rolling. So I think that with digital particularly, where recruitment can be very efficient, like it doesn't require huge expenses of kind of doing things with brick and mortar. It can all be done online, and people can be randomized very efficiently. Like it is feasible to do very high quality research very, very cost effectively. And then the other thing I would say is that by showing that you are really serious about supporting science, it means that you open yourself up to the clinical community in general wanting to collaborate with you. And so, what I would say is that anyone who's out there who has, an entrepreneur who's not a clinician, who has a product that they think is really promising, or an idea that's promising, I can promise you that there are multiple researchers out there in your area who already probably have funding from independent sources like NIH, other sources, who are looking for like good quality in interventions to use in their research. And so I think the key is to really it's very simple. Try and find partners who really know their stuff on the clinical research side, and they will be able to find that funding and those researchers who will help support the clinical research program.
You mentioned earlier about how the pandemic propelled the big health, like everybody become more serious about the mental health. Why is that?
Yeah, I think.
Or everybody becomes so stressed out and everybody start to have mental issue.
Yes. I mean, it's partly that, but I think it's, we've seen a couple of things happen over the last 12, 18 months. The pandemic is obviously the key catalyst here, which is it has been a source of exceptional stress for, huge portions of the population. It's also made it harder for people to access care, effectively. And so, the confluence of those 2 points means that the mental health has really come out into the open. It's risen up the agenda of payers and employers because it's unignorable. People are talking about it a lot more. And what's more, people are unable to access the traditional forms of care. So it's accelerated digital interventions as an obvious way to provide care given the constraints of COVID. So the problem's always been there. It's never we are seeing more people with mental health problems, but the majority of the problem has always been the case. It's just that now it's sort of opened Pandora's box and no one can ignore it.
And you see a lot more bad news in the media, probably increase the anxiety of more and more people. I'm just totally theorizing based on what I see. I don't have any real data to back it up. I have two last questions. I don't want to take up too much of your time. I want to know, what are your 3 biggest challenges that you have overcome in your life, and also during your time as a founder and a CEO of Big Health?
It's a great question. I might sort of talk about these in no particular order, but maybe I'll focus on Big Health because I think it's probably most directly relevant here. I think, but I would say, in retrospect, and hindsight is 2020. We were 10 years early with this idea, and it's been I required an enormous amount of persistence to kind of to get to a point where now suddenly, the time is now, the moment is now for this to. It's finally the sort of world has caught up to a place where these digital first interventions, most so apparently make sense. I'm grateful at one level because it gave us that time to build the clinical evidence base, to gain the conviction around the approach, and make sure that we had the foundations in place, that were necessary to do something like this. But the challenges were, there've been numerous times where, by all rights, the company, we should have died as a company, and I think that this is obviously not specific to us, but I think is I remember us early on getting very close to striking a partnership with a big corporation, and us having no funding, but putting all our chips on that partnership, and really putting our shoulder behind it, and it was it looked amazing, and this company was going to distribute our products and give us loads of marketing money and all the rest of it. And then at the 11th hour, they pulled out. And, I was left with at the time, tens of thousands of dollars of legal fees that I didn't have the money to pay, didn't exist. And so, being able to navigate from that situation, a situation like that, where we're technically insolvent, to be able to keep going, I think are the key sort of experiences that I think what you'll find common in any success story is that in that instance, I'd never raised investment before, but I was I need some money, and so I sort of emailed everyone I knew and said, do you know any rich people who's need money? And then went and talked to them all, and a lot of them were no, it's not really how it works, but you should talk to an investor, let me introduce you to one of my friends, and so, you follow the chain, and eventually you find someone who's, who believes in it, who's willing to invest and give you some money. And that's how we raised our first money. So there's been numerous occasions like that through the history of Big Health where the best way, what the phrase I use is staring into the abyss. Well, I think that to be successful as a founder, particularly in an area that is as complex and challenging and potentially slow moving as healthcare, is you need to be able to confront situations like that. Like I say, look into the abyss where you genuinely have no idea how you're going to navigate it and just keep walking. That, I honestly believe that persistence is the primary characteristic or quality that differentiates success from failure, certainly in this domain, right, of overall healthcare.
Well, thank you so much for your time. And I really enjoyed having our conversation.
Likewise, a pleasure to speak.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Health Technology Podcast. We want to thank our executive producer, Herminio Neto, and our podcast engineer, Andrew Rojek. If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe and leave a review. The Health Technology Podcast is available on all major platforms.